Shoppers across the country keep walking into scenes that feel slightly off. A darkened produce sign. A familiar florist stands already stripped out. A notice taped to a sliding door that once opened every morning without fail. Each small absence lands quietly, the pattern behind them is widening town by town. Supermarkets were once the most stable rooms in American life, places that stayed put while everything else shifted. Now even long-rooted banners are thinning out their maps, trimming locations that have served families for decades, and erasing storefronts that once carried the weight of a whole neighborhood. The losses rarely arrive with fanfare. They surface in local council minutes, in short corporate updates, in brief evening news segments. And the uncomfortable truth is that these closures mark only the early phase of a deeper transformation, reshaping how America shops for food. Tonight, we trace that shift through 7 chains facing their own turning points. Hold still for a moment, because the place you rely on the most may already be standing on shaky ground. Kroger. Dozens of locations trimmed. A map with new gaps. Those figures settle over the country quietly, yet the weight behind them keeps growing. Kroger, the nation's largest traditional grocer, now moves through its own long corridor of contraction, easing stores off its rolls in a way that feels unhurried but unmistakable. Communities feel the shift before the paperwork is final. A pharmacy counter with fewer technicians. A produce aisle that seems to reset more slowly each week. A missing weekend event once used to draw families in. Small changes arrive first, and then the larger one follows the announcement that a store will shut its doors. By the time the notice appears, the impact has already seeped in. Workers begin to plan new routines. Regular shoppers start counting how many miles they will need to drive for fresh food. Neighborhoods lose a place that helped steady their days. Those closures are not abstract. Analysts tracking the chain list several dozen sites marked for departure spread across regions that once anchored Kroger's middle-income base. Each site carries its own years of local history, but in corporate terms, they sit under a category that rarely wins a reprieve: persistent underperformance. The decision lands with a polite tone in official filings, yet the meaning is simple enough. These stores will not stay. The chain must lift its margins, and these units no longer match the numbers required to keep them healthy. Behind these moves stands a broader issue, one that has grown slowly since the early 2010s. The traditional supermarket battles, rising labor costs, higher insurance premiums, complex supply chains, and an escalating price fight with discounters. Kroger absorbs more of these pressures than most because its footprint covers so much of the country. Some districts handle the strain well, others falter. When the weaker stores drag down the group's overall performance, the remedy arrives in the form of closures, freeing capital for remodels and investment in stronger regions. That pressure shapes the feelings inside affected towns. Residents brace for longer drives, narrower choices, and the hollowed-out effect that comes when a large retail box suddenly goes dim. No single chain can promise safety from these patterns. Each community tries to recover its footing, but the pain remains general, felt in the routines that lose their familiar shape. The corner where kids once grabbed bakery samples turns quiet. The broader grocery landscape grows more uneven, especially for families living on tighter budgets. A visitor standing near one of these departing stores notices a certain stillness. The parking lot holds more open spaces than usual. The cart station shows fewer returns. The sliding doors hesitate before opening, a sign that the sensor has not seen steady traffic all day. The interior lights, though bright, cast a more brittle tone when a store begins its final months. Every aisle carries a faint echo, as if the shelves already understand that this space will soon be empty. Kroger continues its strategy of pruning, aiming to strengthen what remains rather than hold on to locations that cannot keep up. The process feels measured, almost gentle in its pacing, but the effect stretches wide. Shoppers accustomed to steady sameness now find that even the most familiar names cannot remain fixed. The country's largest grocer grows leaner, and each closure reminds nearby towns how fragile a food network can be when the margins thin. That truth sets the stage for a deeper retreat taking shape farther south, where another chain with a century of memory prepares to fold back toward its home state. It's why Winn-Dixie. Kroger trims quietly, but Winn-Dixie's retreat feels sharper, almost like watching a neighbor pack up in the middle of the night. One chain pares back to strengthen its core. The other confronts a truth that many in the Deep South hoped would never arrive. For decades, the name carried more than groceries. It marked Saturday chores, post-church errands, and the easy certainty that the red script across the storefront meant you were home. That meaning hangs oddly now because the chain, once stitched into Southern habit, is slipping into a far smaller shape than the region ever expected. The numbers paint that shape with a single cold stroke. More than 90 locations shut their doors through this year alone, followed by another set of 32 scattered across Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, scheduled for closure or sale. By early next year, the map will tilt almost entirely toward Florida, leaving a handful of stores beyond its borders, thin as pins on a nearly blank page. The pace surprises even longtime shoppers. One week, a bakery offers its usual pound cakes. The next, a notice appears announcing liquidation. Schedules compress? Furniture disappears? Familiar shelves stand half-filled in ways that never quite make sense until the final day. The economic story behind this contraction is older than most announcements admit. Winn-Dixie entered the 2010s with a debt load that shadowed every attempt at renewal. Remodeling efforts staggered because each region demanded a different mix of pricing assortment and labor structure. Competitors with lighter cost bases, especially Aldi and Walmart, trained customers to expect narrower margins and quicker resets. Leasing conditions added another strain. Anchor rents in certain suburban plazas rose faster than weekly sales could justify forcing the brand into lease renegotiations that rarely succeeded. Analysts studying the southern retail landscape note that chains with elevated debt-to-equity ratios face outsized risk when consumer traffic softens. One retail researcher put it bluntly during a recent regional review: stores that operate on thin oxygen cannot withstand 3 consecutive years of rising labor costs and falling basket sizes. That remark, though clinical, captures the pressure better than any corporate statement. Even the promotional model turned fragile. The company leaned heavily on circular-based pricing to draw foot traffic, but Fuel Point's digital coupons and multi-buy deals work only when the underlying volume remains steady. Once visits slipped, each discount narrowed the margin further. The chain attempted to modernize its private label line, hoping to catch the loyalty that other grocers win through house brands, yet the rollout landed unevenly across markets. Some districts embraced it, others barely noticed. Into that unevenness walked a new set of landlord expectations, higher operating costs, and the aftershocks of several difficult mergers in regional retail. When viewed together, the closures feel less like a sudden collapse and more like the culmination of long arithmetic. The emotional weight settles in quieter ways. Families accustomed to weekly rhythms now sense a missing thread. That familiar red sign once meant full carts and easy conversation in the checkout line. It meant deli clerks remembering which chicken salad someone liked. It meant holiday weeks filled with warm lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. With each closure, those ordinary comforts leak away. Towns lose a steady touch point. Older residents feel a pinch of displacement. Younger ones discover how far they must drive to find a full-service grocer that accepts the payment methods their households rely on. Some evenings that shift shows itself in a simple scene. A family heads down a 4-lane road passing the store that used to be their end-of-week stop. The lights glow softly through the front windows, but something about the place feels thinner, as if the air inside no longer holds the same welcome. Their turn signal stays dark. They keep driving even though this was once their favorite spot. 3 Stop and Shop. Stop and Shop's recent contraction begins with hard numbers. 32 underperforming stores scheduled for closure across 5 northeastern states, with several already dark before the final deadline. The exits reach from Massachusetts to New Jersey, forming one of the chain's most concentrated pullbacks in years. This is not a random scattering. It is a targeted retreat from locations where sales have flattened and costs have risen beyond what weekly revenue can support. The contrast sharpens when looking back at its beginnings. Stop and Shop once built its name on dependability, growing across New England when few rivals had comparable reach. It blended supermarkets and pharmacies, early introduced strong loyalty programs, and anchored suburban plazas that relied on its traffic. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, the chain stood as a steady option for families who wanted full variety without long drives. Later support from its European parent added buying power and modern logistics, reinforcing an image of stability in a region where routines were slow to change. The pressure points formed over time. Remodels moved unevenly, leaving some stores modern and others dated. Pricing strategies tried to stay competitive, yet high labor and real estate costs pushed everyday prices above those of growing rivals. Loyalty-heavy promotions narrowed appeal for shoppers who preferred simple, direct pricing. Meanwhile, competitors sharpened their own models. Market baskets surged with aggressive value. Trader Joe's captured urban demand with curated assortments. Aldi expanded with a disciplined, low-cost strategy. Stop and Shop added technology, digital coupons, and self-scan lanes, but these upgrades struggled to balance rising overhead. Analysts following the region noted that chains with high fixed costs must pair efficiency with clear value messaging, and Stop and Shop often landed in the middle. The company has made efforts to shift momentum. Selected stores received updated interiors, clearer layouts, and stronger fresh departments. Prepared foods expanded in response to suburban demand. Digital ordering and curbside pickup became more integrated. Supplier relationships were adjusted to support consistent pricing and stronger private label options. Some districts have seen steadier performance, showing that the adjustments are not symbolic. Still, structural limits remain. High regional wages, costly leases, and dense competition continue to shape the chain's margins. Improvements help only when they spread across enough locations to move overall results, and that process remains gradual. Taking a practical view leads to a simple conclusion. Stop and Shop is not vanishing, but it is reshaping itself to protect healthier regions. The closures reflect a decision to prioritize stability over size. Its future depends on delivering consistent value across mixed store conditions, tightening expenses without weakening service, and finding a clearer place within a crowded market. Families across the Northeast will still see the banner, but they will meet a leaner version, one shaped by cost pressure, shifting habits, and the need for disciplined planning. For the fresh market, Elias never spent many years at the fresh market, yet the place still sits in his memory as something steady and decent. He stocked produce through 2 summers, learned the rhythm of the morning bake, and carried the quiet pride that comes from working somewhere that really tried to make things feel a little better than the standard grocery aisle. Even now, long after he moved on, he still stops by a local branch for ordinary things. A jar of pasta sauce, he likes a loaf of seeded bread, the ground coffee he picked up out of habit. He never lingers. He just walks in, gets what he needs, and walks out with a small reminder of those easier years. The shift came without warning. One afternoon, while driving past a suburban plaza, he noticed a dark storefront where a fresh market should have been. The sign was gone. The windows were covered in brown paper. A leasing notice hung at an angle on the glass. The space looked hollow in a way that unsettled him. A week earlier, he had picked up a sandwich there on his day off. That sudden emptiness, no carts, no floral stand, no small bustle, felt like a rug pulled out from beneath a familiar corner of his life. The moment jolted him enough to start searching for answers. What he found traced out a pattern sharper than he expected. 2 stores shut down despite opening less than a year earlier. Nearly 100 workers displaced between them. Locations selected with the assumption that affluent suburbs would guarantee traffic, yet sales never settled into the volume needed to support high lease costs and upscale layouts. He saw discussions about misaligned site selection, uneven performance across districts, and rising competition from chains taking bites out of the same demographic. As he read the list of problems grew tight margins, expensive remodels, and a customer base that liked the idea of premium groceries, but not always the weekly bill that came with them. The facts should not have stunned him, but they did. Part of him stood still, hearing the familiar backroom hum of compressors and the soft clatter of produce crates from years ago. Another part understood this was always a possibility. Fresh Market carried an identity that required precision, the right location, the right traffic mix, the right balance of prepared foods and specialty items. When any piece slipped, the numbers wobbled. He saw the signs back when he worked there: slower mornings, cautious ordering, seasonal resets that tried to compensate for inconsistent footfall. But noticing a problem is different from seeing it spelled out in closures on a news page. Still, knowing the flaws does not dull the sting. For Elias, the chain represented a time when things felt simpler. Steady shifts, reliable co-workers, a cycle that moved without the pace and pressure that define retail now. People had more patience, stores had more room to breathe. The industry had not yet turned into a tight race for margins measured to the decimal. It was never perfect, but it carried a certain clarity he misses. Accepting the present feels heavier than he expected. The closures are real, the struggles are structural. No amount of nostalgia can change that. He swallows the truth slowly, understanding that the chain he respected may not hold the shape it once had. And as he steps back from his screen, he realizes his reaction is not unusual. Across the country, millions are facing their own versions of this loss. Favorite stores dimming long-standing routines, breaking familiar names, shrinking into smaller footprints. The storm pushing these changes is larger than any one chain, and for now it shows no sign of slowing. 5 Foxtrot. What does a convenience chain become when convenience starts slipping? That question crossed my mind the first time Foxtrot missed one of my simple pickup orders. A small delay might not mean much on its own, yet it hinted at something that regulars like me were already feeling: the service was not holding together the way it once did. The signs spread gradually. Orders arrived without the items that made the brand distinct. Customer support took longer to respond. Shelves that used to be tightly curated showed gaps at odd hours. Friends sent screenshots of app errors that forced them to restart transactions twice. None of these issues were dramatic, but they placed pressure on a chain built on the promise of fast, reliable convenience. Online feedback captured the decline with an honesty that in-store conversations often softened. Comment threads on social platforms described shrinking inventories and inconsistent hours. Several posts mentioned arriving at a location only to find limited staff and delayed prep times. Screenshots from review sites told the same story. Customers, who once praised the chain for effortless service, now described waiting longer for basics, receiving partial orders, or finding stores closed earlier than expected with no notice. The tone was not angry. It was disappointed, a steady chorus of people who liked the idea of Foxtrot more than the version that appeared in its final year. Those complaints did not cause the closures, but they formed the trail that led to them. When every third review mentions slower operations or missing items, the underlying issues are rarely isolated. The abrupt shuttering of dozens of locations revealed that the concerns customers shared online had deeper operational roots. A chain that depended on precision in ordering, staffing, and inventory could not afford chronic inconsistency. The overnight darkening of storefronts was the outcome of problems that had been building quietly beneath the surface. The wider reason sits in the distance between ambition and stability. Foxtrot set out to modernize the corner store, a concept appealing enough to draw loyal shoppers across several cities. It aimed for curated goods, sleek interiors, fast tech, and a selection that blended convenience with novelty. That ambition created momentum, but momentum alone could not sustain the business. The operational base had to match the promise, and in many districts it remained thinner than customers assumed. The chain needed steadier labor, deeper inventory buffers, and broader margins to weather slow weeks. Instead, it ran forward with great ideas, but not enough structural reinforcement to carry them through the fluctuations of daily retail. Market pressure intensified every one of those weaknesses. Larger competitors, national grocers, delivery platforms, and big box chains could absorb rising costs without altering the customer experience. Their logistics were stronger, their pricing more flexible, and their ability to survive missteps far greater. Foxtrot had to compete not only on taste and branding, but also on speed and dependability, the two areas in which its cracks became hardest to hide. When supply chains tightened, labor costs rose, and customer expectations grew sharper, the difference between a trend-driven microgrocer and a resilient retail giant became impossible to ignore. Looking back, I still think the concept could have been shaped into something durable. The chain might have benefited from growing slower, strengthening its logistics before expanding its footprint, or narrowing its catalog to a set of core items that guaranteed consistency. Perhaps deeper partnerships with local suppliers or a shift toward a more predictable value model could have given it steadier ground. None of these steps would have solved everything, yet they might have softened the impact of the collapse. I walk past some of the old locations now and feel a muted sense of loss, not just for a store, but for an idea that nearly worked. My view is simple: the chain had potential, and with a firmer foundation it might have weathered the pressures that eventually forced it to close. Instead, it stands as a reminder of how quickly a promising concept can falter when ambition grows faster than the structure meant to support it. 6 Shoppers. Shoppers has been shrinking for years, and the latest round of closures confirms how far the chain has slipped from its old position in the Maryland, D.C. region. I say that as someone who once wore the badge, stocked the shelves, and learned the quiet routine of a store that served more than transactions. Back then, the chain still felt steady. Today, that steadiness is gone. The facts are simple enough. 8 stores shut their doors within a few months following several earlier closures that had already thinned the map. Locations in Essex, New Carrollton, Waldorf, Westminster College Park, Laurel, Germantown, and Capitol Heights all disappeared from the roster. Years earlier, the chain counted more than 40 stores. Now it stands closer to a dozen. This is not a temporary adjustment. It is a retreat shaped by pressure that built over a long period. The issue is broader than any single decision. Shoppers operated with tight margins in a region where every competitor sharpened their model faster. Walmart deepened its grip on value-driven households. Aldi expanded with a focused, disciplined price structure. Giant and Safeway reinforced their middle-market positions using scale the chain could not match. Wegmans entered with large stores and deep service offerings, pulling higher-income shoppers without much effort. Against that landscape, shoppers struggled to define a clear identity. The stores often felt stuck between price-driven and service-driven formats, unable to fully succeed at either. That lack of positioning carried consequences inside the operation. Costs climbed while foot traffic flattened. Some stores maintained stable business, but many others drifted below the threshold needed to remain viable. Once wholesale prices rose and labor costs tightened the room for error, the weaker stores slipped quickly. The closures that followed were not surprising to anyone watching the numbers. They showed a regional chain overwhelmed by structural disadvantages in one of the country's most intensively competitive grocery corridors. Impact rolled across neighborhoods in ways the announcements could not capture. Employees who had stayed for years faced the same difficult choices, familiar to retail workers everywhere: find a new store pivot into another industry or take time they could not afford to rest. Regular shoppers lost a place they counted on for quick trips, familiar aisles, and predictable pricing. Small businesses in nearby plazas felt the shift immediately because foot traffic from the grocery anchor shaped their own survival. None of these secondary effects appeared in the formal statements, but they were felt every day by the people closest to the change. Even now, certain details return to me when I pass the old locations. A sign left up longer than intended, a faded promotional frame in a window, a cart corral standing empty in a lot that used to fill before 9 in the morning. These traces are small, yet they underline the simple truth that the chain's presence once mattered to the area, even if its financial position could no longer support its footprint. The human side of the decline shows up in conversations with former coworkers. Some moved on quickly. Some found new positions but missed the slower, steadier pace the chain once provided. Others still feel the sting of watching a familiar banner contract so sharply. Their feelings do not change the economics, but they reflect what a community loses when a long-standing regional chain fades from view. The descent of shoppers is not dramatic, but it is decisive. Larger rivals established stronger ground, and the market shaped itself around players with deeper resources and clearer identities. A chain positioned in the middle could not withstand that pressure forever. What remains is a smaller version of what once stood across the region, holding on in places where it still makes sense. No resolution will restore what disappeared. The closures mark the point at which the chain could no longer bridge the gap between rising costs and thinning margins. Shoppers continues to operate, but the slow fade is unmistakable, shaped by a market that rewards scale and clarity more than familiarity. 7 Homeland. We could not carry the weight anymore. That line, spoken by a Homeland executive during a routine briefing, carried more truth than anyone expected. It was not dramatic, just plain and steady, the kind of sentence used when a chain has run out of softer explanations. For many employees and shoppers in Oklahoma and the surrounding region, it summed up a strain they had felt long before the words reached a microphone. People who depended on Homeland for predictable shopping rhythms understood that strain differently. Some had worked there long enough to witness the slow tightening of schedules, the leaner shifts, the cautious ordering. Others simply visited week after week, noticing when certain staples arrived late or when departments operated with fewer hands. These small signs formed the texture of daily life, a reminder that the chain was operating closer to its limits than it once admitted. No anger, no surprise, just a steady recognition that the ground was shifting beneath a familiar name. The impact showed up first in the practical routines. Families switched their weekly stops to larger competitors because they needed fuller shelves and longer hours. Elderly shoppers who preferred the smaller scale of Homeland found themselves driving farther than they liked. Small businesses that relied on traffic from the grocery anchor saw lighter afternoons. None of this happened quickly. It unfolded in a gradual downward line store by store, season by season, until the closures made the trend official. Behind that trend sat the issue Homeland had grappled with for years, a cost structure that pushed too hard on a margin already thin for mid-sized regionals. The chain operated in a market where national players grew faster, priced more aggressively, and negotiated with suppliers from a position Homeland could not match. Insurance costs rose. Freight became more unpredictable. Labor expenses climbed in a way that left little breathing room. And unlike large grocers with broad networks, Homeland could not redistribute losses across dozens of high-performing districts. When one store struggled, the entire system felt the pressure. The facts that followed were blunt but unsurprising. 5 locations were marked for closure in the most recent announcement, continuing a reduction pattern that had been visible for years. Some sites showed falling foot traffic, others faced lease costs that no longer aligned with weekly revenue. The move was explained in calm corporate language efficiency, optimization, long-term viability, but the meaning was simple. The chain needed to shrink to survive. A few cues at the remaining locations underline how delicate the balance has become. Certain shelves reset more slowly. The mix of products shifts toward items with steadier margins. A modest quietness settles in during parts of the day that once held more activity. These changes do not signal collapse. They signal a chain trying to hold its shape with the resources it still has. Homeland continues to operate, but the atmosphere feels more cautious than confident. Through all of this, the emotional register stays low, not because the situation lacks weight, but because those closest to the chain have lived with this trajectory long enough to accept it. Longtime customers remember when the stores felt fuller. Former employees recall steadier years when operations ran with less tension. Everyone involved understands that a regional grocer competing against giants must navigate impossible math sooner or later. The closures do not mark the end of Homeland, but they show the limits faced by smaller regionals in a market that rewards scale above all else. The chain will continue where it makes sense, leaner than before, shaped by forces that no single banner can control. And in the towns that lose their stores, the absence settles in quietly, another reminder of how unforgiving the modern grocery landscape has become. Across all these stories, a single truth settles in. These are difficult days for American grocery life. Towns lose familiar signs, families redraw their weekly routines, and chains that once seemed unshakable now feel smaller than their history suggests. Yet even in this uneasy moment, the landscape is not defined only by decline. The same country that built coast-to-coast retail networks, reinvented supply chains, and pushed innovation into every corner of daily shopping has never lacked the ability to rebuild. Change, even when painful, creates new openings. Smaller players can rethink their strengths, communities can support the stores that remain, and the industry can learn from the missteps now so visible. America has weathered far heavier shifts than this, and each time it found a way to stand firm again. The grocery map is being redrawn, but the story is not finished, and neither is the hope within it.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage segregation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today's analysis made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.